So here's the deal. Everyone can play retro games now. Phones, PCs, little handheld thingies. The barrier to entry has just completely been eliminated. So in this video, I'm going to recommend some weird, interesting games that I think are worth booting up and checking out. They might have a few hiccups, but I think they're cool because they do something different. And I often think that interesting is, well, more interesting than good, if you know what I mean. About half of these games never came out in English officially, but luckily there's been a ton of awesome fan translations done for these, so even if you speak English, you can play these games in a way that was never really officially intended. And then, in addition to the fan translations, the other half are just oddball games that got overlooked. I've got a real mix of games here, so even if one doesn't really hit the spot for you, maybe the next one will, so stick around, maybe you'll find the perfect game for you. And remember, you can basically play these on anything, so just get familiar with your favorite search engine, and I'm sure you'll find a guide that'll walk you through the process of getting these up and running. If you bumped into me on the street and asked for a Super Famicom recommendation, I'd probably say Tetris Battle Gaiden, but then I would say Gunple Gunmans Proof, because it's a really awesome game. At first glance, I'm sure your mind goes straight to A Link to the Past, and that's pretty much what you're getting here, but with a bunch of the variables swapped out. Instead of the fantasy setting, you're going to be in a Wild West world that has been invaded by aliens. And instead of hacking and slashing your way to save the day, you're going to be shooting and crawling under gunfire through dungeons. It's a really clever and charming fun take on the Zelda formula that often feels like Mother 3, Shin-Chan, and A Link to the Past all got into a blender. You play as a kid who is possessed by an alien space sheriff who's on the hunt on Earth for these other alien convicts who have escaped here and also taken on their own earthly forms. The structure here is basically built around this central hub town where you branch off and go collect bounties, come back and collect your rewards. And also in this town you can gain access to items and new abilities like new guns, like a rocket launcher or a shotgun, by talking to the town's gunsmith. But when you're out collecting a bounty, one of my favorite things about the gun system is when the gun power-up drops from an enemy, it stays there on the ground rotating through all of the different guns that you've learned, and you can pick what kind of gun you want to really specialize in. This is one of those games that was made at the end of the Super Famicom's life cycle, so that's probably why it was never officially translated, because they were already moved on to the N64 during that time. But if a slapstick, sci-fi, western Zelda game sounds good to you, I really hope you find a way to play this one. Alright, so Game Freak, you know, the Pokemon people. Everybody knows that. But what fewer people know about is their non-Pokemon games that they made. But the one I want to talk about here is Warriors, the Blue Dragon Legend, The Two Heroes. It's another Japan-only Super Famicom game that they made right after making the original Pokemon games and before those even made it over here to the West. So it was made in this strange period for them where the worldwide obsession over Pokemon didn't happen yet, but they were still cranking out new games. Warriors of the Blue Dragon Legend is a very interesting game that has a lot of the elements that you might recognize from Pokemon from around this time, especially the really amazing artwork by Ken Sugimori. Due to the timing of this one, I get a ton of Gen 2 vibes off of the art in this game. But beyond the superficial similarities to the Pokemon series, you play as a young boy who's destined to become a great hero like his father. His village is at war with and is being overtaken by monsters, and you need to save your sister who has been taken by a giant one that looks suspiciously like Ho-Oh. The gameplay here is split into 3 different ways. There's the overworld exploration sections that are similar to like Zelda or even Pokemon. Then there are the visual novel-y kind of sections where you're talking to NPCs, and when you enter buildings you can kind of look around a little bit and find items. And then finally there's the combat system, which when you first take a look at it, it is this side view battle screen, but it looks like a real-time like platformer or something, but it's actually not. It's a turn-based side-scrolling kind of combat system, which is pretty unique. Basically everything here happens on a grid, like when you move, the enemies move, and when you attack, the enemies attack, that sort of thing. It becomes about spacing and blocking appropriately to get through each of the combat encounters. The reasons why this one probably wasn't released outside of Japan is because there's a lot of like Japanese cultural stuff that I think they just thought wouldn't translate to a Western audience. And also, Pokemon really wasn't a huge massive hit, so it wasn't a foregone conclusion that a Game Freak game was going to be translated and ported over here. So if you're a fan of Gen 2 era Ken Sugimori artwork like me, I think this one is just worth booting up just for that alone. Monster Maulers is a really unique arcade game that blends fighting and beat-em-up elements in a pretty unexpected way. Instead of facing off against like the typical human-style fighters, you're gonna be battling these colossal monsters in this boss rush mode. That said, it still plays a lot like a fighting game. It just puts those mechanics into a new sort of context. Most of the game is in this boss-only sort of gameplay, but later on there are these occasional side-scrolling sections that really feel more like a traditional beat-em-up, but they're really easy and they might just be here to kind of pad things out a bit. It really doesn't add much to the game, but if this game interests you, you can even boot it up with a friend and take on all of the bosses co-op. It only takes about half an hour to get through this one, but it's pretty unique and fun, so it's worth coming back to every now and then to see if you can kind of master your character's main moves. Violinist of Hameln is a puzzle platformer on the Super Famicom where you play as a violinist and you guide around his assistant Flute. You have to use Flute to solve different puzzles and get around different obstacles by doing stuff like using her as a stepladder or turning her into an ostrich so she can cross spikes. You know, logical puzzle solving stuff. That said, when you turn her into different animals, that's not really turning her into another animal, she's just getting into a costume, but those costumes give her different abilities to do stuff like crossing spikes or jumping really high in a frog suit. The graphics here are what is really charming and funny about this one because it's based off a comedy manga by the same name, and it's all about how this violinist hero takes advantage of this girl's goodwill to have her do a lot of dirty work in their adventures. So boiled down, this game is kind of an escort mission, but honestly, it's not as frustrating as that might seem. But yeah, this is a really fun and charming game, and I think if you like the quirky kind of vibe of this game, you should definitely check this one out if you're looking for another great 16-bit puzzle platformer. Speaking of puzzle platformers, Samurai Kid on the Game Boy Color is not exactly what I was expecting. I was expecting a game called Samurai Kid to be an action game, but this is more of a puzzle platformer. Instead of primarily using your sword like you might expect a samurai, you use the gourd that you carry around a lot to turn your enemies into blocks that allow you to solve puzzles and hold down buttons. You can also charge up your moves to do stuff like slash through crates or make a tornado with your fan. But yeah, this is like all about using the tools that you have to solve the puzzles that are in front of you. The graphics here are really sharp and colorful, even for a Game Boy Color game. I just really like how well defined these characters are. I know that was more of a necessity on the Game Boy Color itself, but I think this game up-res on a newer display looks really sharp still. This is another one of the games that never officially came out in English, but there is a fan translation out there for you. So if you're looking for a puzzle game with some unique samurai trappings to it, this one's worth checking out. Alright, time for yet another Zelda-style game, and it's not even the last one in this video. I don't know, I guess I was on that Zelda kick for real. But this time, it is Willow on the NES. This is based on the movie, you know, of the same name from Lucasfilm with Warwick Davis and everything, but it really doesn't follow the plot too closely. Just imagine this is a story that happens in that world and isn't necessarily a direct adaptation of the story you see in the movie. When you first set your eyes on this one, it is pretty clear that it is aping Zelda's style quite a bit, but it's not really that level of quality, to be honest. There's a ton of confusing mazes, so I really recommend looking up online maps or something if you're going to play this one. But that said, it's still a pretty solid oddity that if you're into leveling up, collecting items, learning magic spells, you know, all the action RPG kind of stuff from this era, this is a pretty good choice for you. I'd say the graphics here are really amazing for the NES, because there's all sorts of detail to them that, even though it's an 8-bit game, it looks like it's slowly edging closely to a 16-bit graphical style. The music here is also really incredible, and I really like the songs kind of on their own, but in-game it can get overshadowed by the fact that the tracks restart really often, because if you leave a zone, imagine if you leave a battle zone and then go into the overworld theme, you do that quite a bit in this game, and the restarting of the tracks can get pretty irritating. But with all that said, it's not the greatest game, but, you know, if this looks interesting to you, you might as well boot it up if you can. Dragon's Revenge is a pinball game on the Genesis that is a follow-up to a port of Devil's Crush to the Genesis that itself was called Dragon's Fury, so yeah, this is a kind of weird, estranged cousin to the Crush pinball series. The thing that I like to see in video pinball games is things happening on the tables that can't really happen in real-life pinball. That's probably because the game that got me into video pinball games was Pokemon Pinball, and that's filled with that sort of stuff, and there's really no arguing that that's still a top-tier entry in this genre. But set your expectations a lot lower for this, because this isn't anything close to as good as Pokemon Pinball. It's a fantasy-themed table with dragons and damsels in distress. It's a very 80s dark fantasy take, you know, like airbrushed fan art vibes. And sometimes that kind of schlock is really fun to indulge in. The physics with the ball here are even a bit wonky, but I still think it's pretty fun. I'd say that everything top to bottom here is like direct-to-video, fantasy, best of the worst tier quality, you know? But that said, I think that's still a fun sort of thing to check out every once in a while. But if you're like me and just like when ball hit flipper make noise, I clap like seal. So if you're looking for a mindless sort of game to occupy yourself, this is really totally a fine, fun, dumb, stupid game to play in a half-lucid state. Cocoron is another super janky game, but it's another game that has a really weird hook to it, and that is that it's really heavy on character customization, which was really unique for the NES. Before you start your game, you create your hero that you want by choosing a head, a body, and a weapon, each coming with their own different attributes that affect how your game is gonna feel to play. Basically, how much damage you deal out, how much health you have, and how your character feels to jump. As for gameplay, it's very bare bones Mega Man, probably because it was directed by Akira Kitamura, who was the planner on the first Mega Man. With all that said though, it's really bare bones, like very sparse, and all the enemy placement feels like it was very haphazard, and the levels are kind of crap, to be honest. And then you get to the bosses, and the bosses are, you know, like Mega Man style bosses, where you have to dodge a lot of projectiles, but all of their attack patterns are equally as haphazard as the enemy placement, so it's just a honestly kind of terrible game. But I think that the character customization is really fun to fool around with here, and I think that's more than enough to keep people interested for 15 minutes or so while they boot this up and check it out. So if you don't mind scraping the absolute bottom of the barrel to just see some neat kind of ideas from this era, you know, you could do this game. Play this, I guess. I don't know. Top Hunter Roddy and Cathy is a Neo Geo game that brings Metal Slug to mind, but it's really just kind of a weird beat 'em up with characters that have stretchy arms like Ristar or Luffy from One Piece. Beyond the arm stuff, the main gimmick here is the plane switching, where you can jump between the foreground and background, which in theory makes it a strategical kind of thing where you can hop between planes to avoid enemy attacks and stuff, but I was just terrible at that. It was often pretty hard to gauge really what was on which plane, especially during different boss fights, so I was really bad at it, but I could see that if you played this game often enough, you'd get more familiar with it. Anyway, think like grabbing and tossing enemies like Ristar, and it's a pretty chill game that you can play co-op with a buddy. This is also a game that has gotten a hamster re-release, so you can even pick this game up on modern consoles. The Frog for Whom the Bell Tolls is a Japan-only game on the Game Boy, and if you're a big fan of Zelda, you might have already heard of this one. It's known for being basically the source of the engine that eventually powered Link's Awakening. While there are some clear Zelda vibes with this one, it really stands out in a few key ways. For starters, it's much more focused on storytelling than the early Zelda games, and the combat here is automatic. Like when you bump into another enemy and engage into a fight, the stronger man comes out on top. Aside from that stuff though, you'll still be exploring and collecting items to progress, similar to a Zelda game, but with a little bit of another tweak here. In this game, power-ups like extra health and attack boosts aren't really just bonuses like they might be in a Zelda game. They're like necessary for the game progression. For example, if you're short on a heart or two, you like literally can't get past certain enemies that are blocking your progress. So it's like your health and your power are being used as the gating mechanism that like a Zelda item like a hookshot or something might be used in a Zelda game. But beyond all that stuff, it's just a fully charming game. It's full of quirky characters and really funny dialogue. I'd say the fan translation that I've been playing really nails the funniness of this game. It's just a real lighthearted good time. The story revolves around two different rival princes who get turned into frogs and need to work together to undo that and defeat the big bad at the end. You might even recognize some of the characters from this game, like Prince Richard, who appears in Link's Awakening, or Prince Sable, who pops up as an assist trophy in Smash Bros. So since Nintendo has never officially translated this game, and if you're a fan of Nintendo, I really highly recommend checking this one out. The fan translation is more than competent enough. This is a really great game to check out. The Jetsons Invasion of the Planet Pirates is a really good SNES game, even though it might not be expected because it's a licensed game. It's a 2D side-scroller where you play as George Jetson, and you use a vacuum to suck up items and enemies, kinda like in a Kirby kinda way, but the cool part is that you can also suck to the walls and to the ceilings. The graphics are super colorful, and it really is just a really good looking game. But the real wow factor here is just how well it nails the mechanics and game feel. It was so good that they even took this game and IP scrubbed it, and then put a different IP from Japan on it and released it there, because this game really was just that good of a foundation. I think you should check this one out even if you don't really have any care for the Jetsons brand. It's just a really great unsung solid platformer out there. Crusader of Centy is probably the most well-known game in this video, but I still think it doesn't really get the love that it needs. It's another Zelda-style adventure game, but you end up recruiting animals that help you out and give you new abilities. And that's because you play as a character who loses his ability to speak to humans, but gains that ability with animals. Visually, it looks really nice. It being a late-era Genesis game, it makes it feel, like the developers really figured out how to use this platform to its fullest. The music is also really great, but with all that said, it came out in 1994, which was kind of the tail end of the 16-bit generation, so it just became a sort of unknown. But with that said, you can actually play this game on the Nintendo Switch, because it's part of the Nintendo Online expansion pass, like the Genesis section there. But I think this game is a really, really awesome game, so make sure you check this one out. There's even a secret cameo from Sonic. The Sonic lounging on the beach chair image, that's from this game. So if you're into classic top-down Zelda, I think you definitely should boot up Crusader of Centy. Alright, and that was my video recommending some non-obvious games to play on your retro devices. I really think that these are some really neat games, even if some of them are honestly not too good. There are some really excellent ones in here though. Yeah, I always like to explore and find unique stuff, even if it has a few janky elements to it or not. But if you ended up liking this video, make sure you do all the YouTube-y stuff. I really appreciate it so much. And yeah, thank you for watching.